Hey everyone, my name is George Originales, and you are listening to Radio Faith, episode 14. In this episode, you will hear my conversation with my good friend Johann Acuña. Johann is a musician and an associate worship pastor who serves at Cross Church in Arkansas. He shares with us what it has been like for him to walk faithfully, even though God doesn't always provide a clear roadmap. He also mentions some of the challenges he has faced, which God is using to grow him in further spiritual maturity. So turn up your volume and get ready for another great conversation here on Radio Faith. So that's I guess we'll get started with that then. So you said right now this is going to be your 7th year at Cross Church. You moved to I guess the home campus over there at Cross Church. In the prior to the 7 years, what was it like transitioning? Because I mean, you and I grew up at Segunda, and then God called you to move to a different church. What was that like?
Well, the process of being called to Cross Church was it was a little tricky for me, because I was serving at a church in Sugarland, which was, pretty much my hometown. I'd grown up there, and that's went to school there. And so I was at a church, and it fit my skill set. And because I was more of like a classically trained musician, and it was a more kind of traditional music that we did there, and so it kind of fit, and it was fine. Everything was cool, but I just kind of had a restlessness in my spirit, and I just kind of felt like God telling me, "Hey, get ready. I'm about to do something." And I didn't know what that meant. I really didn't. And so I was just kind of like, okay, and I got a call from Julio just out of the blue. And even though at that time he was already he was already in Sugar Land. I mean, we were right down the road from each other, but, we didn't talk too much. So when he called me, I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. And he basically told me that he was going to Cross Church in Arkansas, and he needed to find someone to help lead the instrumental music at the church. So the band, write charts, do that kind of thing. So kind of like a worship associate position. And I told him, I was like, well, man, I'm flattered that you asked me, but at the same time, I wasn't thinking about moving. And, at the same time, I knew that there was something that God was going to do, but I thought, man, surely he's not going to ask me to go to Arkansas. You know what I'm saying? Because when you live in Texas, Arkansas is not the one place where you're thinking, oh, I want to move there. But he was just like, well, keep praying about it. I just want you to pray and see what God does. And in the middle of all that process, I just kind of felt God confirm. And I ended up just being, through just conversations with the leadership of that church that I was serving at, just kind of discerning that, I really do think, even if it's not Cross Church, I think my time here is done. I think God is released me from this place, and I ended up resigning. I think like August 29th, 2011. So like on a Monday afternoon, I just resigned because I felt God was going to do something. It was kind of weird. They were very surprised, just like, hey, you don't have something in mind, because, and I think a lot of people's heads, especially right now, they're like, you don't resign your job unless you have something already lined up. You know what I mean? Like no one quits their job and they're just like, well, I have no idea what I'm going to do, but I think God's going to do something, so I'm just going to resign. Because that doesn't make a lot of sense. Most people are, they're going to stick to a job even if they don't like it until a sure thing happens. And then they're like, okay, I can leave this one and go to the next one. But there were two passages that really kind of just spoke to me in that time. And it was in Hebrews where it says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. And I thought, well, faith is, like Hebrews says, it's the evidence of things hoped for. The evidence of things unseen. You don't see it necessarily. There's a sureness, but it's a hope. It's something like that hasn't happened yet. And so that was one passage. The other one was Genesis 12 and the calling of Abraham, and how God called Abraham. And he didn't tell Abraham, hey, listen, I need you to leave your father's house. I need you to leave this land that you know, and then I'm going to send you here, and then you're going to go over here. And he didn't give him an itinerary. He just said, hey, I'm calling you, leave what you know, and I'm going to show you where you're going. and there was this trust and this faith that we see. God just really used that in my life to speak to me in that moment. So I said, man, I think God's calling me to have faith. I resigned. And it was surprising to everyone, and it was surprising to me too, because I had a job and then suddenly I didn't have a job. And so you're kind of left kind of wondering, okay, am I crazy? Am I not crazy? What is God going to do? But through that process of praying, and I did end up at Cross Church, and it took about several weeks for all that to happen. But I've been here at Cross Church ever since. And so about 6.5 years right now. It'll be 7 years in October. But God has just really used this place to grow me spiritually, personally, also in my area, which is music. So it's grown me musically. And the awesome thing is that, I met my wife here. And so,
It's awesome.
I can definitely say, this was all from the Lord, for sure. And of course, like looking back, hindsight is 2020. So looking back is like, oh, okay, yeah, this makes total sense. But in the moment, it doesn't make sense. The only thing is that, man, I think God is calling me and I have to go, but you don't know.
Yeah.
And so that's where faith comes in. And I think that's where God is honored. If we knew everything, it's almost like we wouldn't necessarily need God's calling. We wouldn't necessarily need faith because we just know. As believers, we know that there's some things that we're not going to know, or there's some things that we're not going to know right now, maybe later. And that's where we have to trust God's voice, God's calling. Know that, like it says in Romans, that everything will work out for our good, but ultimately for his glory. And we can trust that, for those that of us that believe in him, he's got us, and we're going to be all right.
That's awesome, man. It's you mentioned that whole I guess I've heard it described, excuse me, as holy dissatisfaction with where you're at. Where you're at is good, you're comfortable, but God is calling you elsewhere. And then there's that, I guess, looking into the darkness. Okay, where exactly are you leading me? And he's just saying, hey, just come on. I'll show you one step at a time. It's interesting that you mentioned Abraham and how God called him away from his hometown without exactly giving him the roadmap. And my family and I are actually in that position right now in transition, just going one step at a time, just really leaning on God to show us where he wants us to go. So that's just really good words of encouragement. And you brought to mind something a mentor of mine recently told me, that God knows that we don't know. And that's where grace and mercy comes in. He just expects us to be faithful and trust him. So that's really good stuff. You mentioned how right now, or pretty much throughout your service in ministry, that you've served in the area of music. So can you speak a little bit on that, and I guess purpose? How does one discover their purpose and the way by which God wants you to serve in his kingdom and to the overall world?
Yeah, so purpose is that's a big deal to most people, and I feel like, especially like the younger generation, millennials, I think there's a lot of us, that are in that generation where we're really searching for purpose. And I think we see that a lot in just how active millennials are with like social justice and issues of like suffering and trying to end injustices in this world. And it's almost, I think, because we're searching for, we want to make a difference, like I want our lives to mean something. And I believe that, God has created all of us, you, me, everyone. He's created us purposefully and intentionally. And what I mean by that is that each one of us is different. We're all unique, and we're also been given unique gifts and giftings and just qualities that come naturally to you. I mean, there's some people that they can just speak really well to crowds. And then there's other people that, man, they're terrified by that thought, but they can organize things super, super well. And they can look at a vision and make that a reality. Whereas maybe someone, who is more geared towards just being social and they're an extrovert, maybe they're not as not, I want to say qualified, but they're not as gifted naturally in those areas. And so for me, I feel like God has just given me an innate ability to do music. And it really is his gift that he gave me, because it has been something that has been part of my life really since I can remember. I'm the youngest of three kids, and I grew up watching and listening to my sister play piano. So she was playing piano at the church, and she'd be practicing at home because she was in lessons. And so as a little kid, I would listen to her practice. And then my older brother as well, like, he played guitar, and so I would watch him play. And so like music has kind of just always been, around me. And so I think God used that to like pique my interest of like, oh, maybe this is something I want to do, and God really opened some doors for me and allowed me the opportunity to take lessons and then, do music in middle school and high school. And, and so I feel like even though most of my preparation musically was not like specifically geared with a ministry in mind, God used all of my music preparation to equip me for ministry. And so I think for that's like a principle that I think just really can apply to anyone, and that any experience, any job, or any training, God, I don't want to say God will use it, because I don't want to say, like, hey, I'm going to speak for God here, but I really think there's a really, really high probability that God is going to use your experiences, your gifting, your training, wherever He calls you. He may not use it all the time. He may not use it initially, but I think God is, He created you with a purpose. He didn't mess up if He gave you something like a talent or something that you're really good at, or just something that comes naturally. And we see in the New Testament that there's different gifts of the Spirit, and that we're all one body, but we have different functions, and so we're all gifted differently, and I think with a purpose. So I think when someone is trying to discover their calling or their purpose, I think number one, we can use just biblical examples to kind of help shed some light on our own lives. And so like thinking when Jesus called the first apostles in Mark. I think it's Mark chapter 1. So Jesus calls the apostles, and what were they doing? They were fishing.
Yeah.
And so Jesus comes up and says, hey, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. And so in these apostles, he didn't say, okay, I know you're fishermen, but leave that, and I'm going to teach you how to do something that you have no idea how to do, that has no correlation to anything you've done in your entire life. He said, hey, you're fishers or fishermen. Now I'm going to take that same idea and just put a divine purpose on it. So you're still fishing. You're still going to be casting out nets, but it's not going to be the nets, the physical nets for fish. It's going to be, like Jesus said in the parable, the seed of the word, and you're going to be throwing it out, and it might take root. It may not take root, but just like a fisherman, you're going to be throwing it out. You're going to have the patience. You're going to wait, and you're going to see God give the growth, or you may not see God give the growth. In that same parable, it says that, maybe the thorns or, choked the roots where there was no life, or the birds came and took the seed. And just like with fishermen, sometimes they would cast out the nets, nothing would come in, so they have to cast it out again. And so it was something familiar for them. And I think that's a lesson for us. I mean, I think that there's a lot of times where we feel like, okay, if God is calling me, especially for people who may already be like in a corporate setting or a secular job, and it's something that's not in church. A lot of times people think, well, in order for me to be called by God, I have to like completely abandon everything I've done and just do something totally different. And that might be the case. It really could. But it also might be that God wants to use those skills, or maybe even that setting, for that to be your mission field. I think we just need to be able to see, okay, how has God created me? How has God gifted me? Because there might be a clue in there about your purpose. And then I think the other thing is just like seek the Lord. It's not all about just self knowledge, or, just like, well, I need to know myself better.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, but ultimately there's one person who knows us better than anybody, and that's God.
Yeah.
And so we can seek His wisdom and His discernment and His voice in our lives. And I think the Holy Spirit will confirm in our lives what our callings are, what our giftings are. And once we have that clarity, I think, then we see this also in Mark, where Jesus called the apostles, and it says, hey, I'll make you fishers of men. It says they immediately left their nets and followed Him.
Yeah.
So there's like, once you know your purpose, like, don't sit on it and think, okay, yeah, that's cool, I'll look into this next year. No, immediate obedience in your calling, because I think that's really where the blessing is. Not necessarily like blessing for your life, but blessing for God's glory. That's where you see the impact. And obviously you see the blessing of God's provision and the blessing of God's covering in your life, because you're following His will. Another illustration like that I really love is Elisha. When Elisha was called in First Kings, he was out in the field, right? Like with the oxen and all that.
Yeah.
He gets called. So he's like, okay, I need to go say bye to my parents. He does. And then he slaughters the oxen, as a sacrifice. uses the wood of the yoke or whatever as the that was holding the ox, and he uses that as the wood for the sacrifice. And then he goes. And so for Elisha, there's no turning back. I literally just destroyed what was my livelihood. Um, so I think not necessarily that we have to like burn all our bridges so that we have no choice but to follow Christ, but I think there's something powerful there in just the security that Elisha had. And I think that's really the takeaway of just like the hymn we sing. Man, I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. And so just a total commitment and a total obedience, which really is the result of God's peace and that clarity and Him providing the clarity of our purpose and the faith, like that we talked about earlier. Just knowing that, okay, God's called me, He's going to see it through, and I have faith in Him and His ability to guide me in my life and to provide me or provide for me every step of the way.
That's awesome. It's the examples you gave of Elisha and then the apostles, like you said, as soon as God called them, they immediately accept the calling. As you mentioned, God's initial calling to all people is unto himself. Come to me. And then once we go to him, he gives us, I guess, the fullness of that calling. Okay, now you're with me, and now this is what I want you to go do. So it's come to me, and now go do this for me, for the kingdom. And like you said, just looking back at your life and seeing how God has gifted you, it makes me think of that if there's like a double purpose to the giftedness and talents that God has given us. Like right now, you have each person is in a situation. So within that situation you're in now, look to how you can honor and glorify God through it, as Colossians says. And then also understand that the situation you find yourself in currently is also for the purpose of the now, but in preparation also for tomorrow, and that God is using that for the honor and glory of his name and for his kingdom, and to love your neighbor through that. So you said that your giftedness and talent is through music. In that area of life and ministry, what opportunities and challenges have arisen as you serve through that?
I think probably the biggest challenge for anyone that is in any type of music ministry is probably that music is something that you do the least of. And I think that's surprising, because you think, man, I'm a musician. I like playing. I like maybe writing music. And so you think, man, if I'm in music ministry, I'm going to be doing a lot of music. And the truth is, yeah, you definitely get to do a lot. But as a as a pastor or as someone who's serving in worship ministry or music is just the adjective that describes your real calling, which is ministry.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so a lot of times, like right now, it's very common to call someone a worship pastor. And, it used to be like, hey, you are a music minister, but now it's called, worship pastor. And I think a lot of times we focus too much on the adjective
Yeah.
and not on the fact that you are a pastor. Pastor, and what the real word means is that you oversee, right? You oversee sheep. That's the concept of that word. And so really you're a shepherd. Any good shepherd is not going to get so caught up in the fact that, ooh, I'm a shepherd, I get to be a shepherd, that he neglects the sheep. It almost doesn't make sense when you think of it that way. He's not going to be so obsessed with maybe like, oh, my shepherd staff, I'm so glad I have a shepherd staff, this is so cool, I could guide the sheep, and then or maybe hit a wolf that's going to come over here. He's not so obsessed with the act of shepherding that he misses the purpose.
Yeah.
And I think in music ministry, that's very easy to do because we love music. And a lot of times you gravitate towards things that you love or things that are your gifting. And you tend to focus so much on those strengths that the things that really matter, like discipling your people, maybe even the atmosphere of the worship service, or how conducive that worship service really is to how conducive that is to actually accomplishing the biblical model of what a worship gathering is supposed to be. Those are things that aren't necessarily musical. Pastoring someone, discipling someone isn't necessarily a musical thing. And just like we see in Ephesians 4, there's really no, when he's saying, hey, I've called some to be, prophets, evangelists, teachers, and all these listings, there's not something that says, hey, and he called some to be worship pastors. It didn't say that. And so all of that is about really surrounds the Word of God and discipling people. And if you keep reading, the whole point is you are equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. But if you keep reading, there's like a goal there. It's not just, well, yeah, just equip them. I think it says something like you're going to equip them till we achieve unity and till they achieve mature manhood to the fullness of Christ.
Mm.
And that is our goal in any ministry, but even in worship ministry. And so for me, biggest challenge has been remembering that. In fact, I have a little note that I wrote to myself on my desk, and it just says, disciple someone today.
Wow.
Because it's super easy to be like, man, I have a list of things I got to do. Like Easter's coming, I got to do this, and then oh, you know what? We have a special event this week, and I got to do this, and you do all these tasks, and you don't realize, man, I haven't even focused on people at all. And I think as pastors, again, using the shepherd mentality, it would be, a disservice to the sheep for you to be a shepherd, and you're so preoccupied by good things, oh, I need to get a new shepherd staff, I need to get, this, or I need to prepare the barn, or I need to do whatever, that the sheep are over here completely unattended, and I think when the sheep are unattended, that's when the enemy can come and he can seek to devour and to destroy and to mislead. And I think we see that in a lot of our congregations. I think we see that our people sometimes are neglected by the very ministry we've been called to.
Wow.
And and I feel like, and I don't want to, this is not an accusing statement, but I just think it's really easy for worship ministry to do that because you have rehearsals, you have to practice, you have to learn songs, you have to set up service orders. You need to make sure all the media guys know that, hey, the lighting needs to be this, or hey, are the lyrics correct for the screens that the congregation is going to see? And like there's so many logistical things that have to happen, and those are good things. I mean, you definitely don't want wrong light cues or wrong words or any of that, but that's not what God has called us to ultimately.
Mm.
It's to disciple people. And so that's probably the biggest challenge that I faced. And I think the other one is just flexibility. I think someone might be called to, let's use, we can use worship ministry as the example. Someone's called to worship ministry. Hey, that's great, but that can kind of be a vague calling. You know what I mean? Someone saying I'm called to worship ministry is not as specific as God called me to this church at this moment for this long to do specifically this job. Like that's very specific. But most of the time, God doesn't give us those specific things. There's a general sense of a calling, like, hey, you might be called to this group of people at this church. But I think we need to have the discernment and the flexibility to know that might look differently from time to time.
Mm.
For me personally, my ministry has changed a lot while I was here at Cross Church. So our worship ministry, we went from campus specifics, or we are a multi-site church, and so each worship ministry was kind of its own thing. But then we went from that model to what we called a global worship ministry, to where there was one guy who was in charge of every campus as far as worship. And so we went with that model for a few years, and then now we're back to the campus specific model. But over the last year and a half, I've also been, in addition to all the stuff I was normally doing on the English side, now I'm leading worship for the Spanish side. And so it's like, man, these last 6.5 years have kind of been a whirlwind and nothing has stayed the same. And I think if we are so entrenched in, no, this is specifically what I'm supposed to be doing, and I don't want to change, that sometimes we miss what God is doing because the ministry is changing. New people are coming, new people are going, there are new needs. Obviously, the mission is always the same, to preach the gospel and to make disciples. But sometimes that might look differently in each setting, especially as the years go by. And so I think I see a lot of, especially probably younger guys, there's a lot of us that it's very easy to become bitter or just negative, or kind of cynical because we don't embrace the flexibility of ministry. And that's the truth. I mean, it's going to change. You know what I mean? Like, I've had people in my ministry who, when I first came to Cross Church, they were single. Now they're married and have like 3 kids. And so if I kept treating them like, no, you're still a 24-year-old single guy, that would be crazy. You know what I mean? Because it's like, bro, I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm married and I have 3 kids. And so just like someone's family situation changes, so does ministry.
Yeah.
But sometimes as pastors, we forget that. And we're like, no, I need to be doing this and this exact same thing we've always done. And so just knowing that God is probably going to adjust or tweak our calling in some ways, and we need to be okay with that.
That's really good words of encouragement and just guidance. It made me think of when Jesus ascended back into heaven. He left us with the Great Commission, as we call it. Go make disciples and of all nations, and then instruct them as I've instructed you. And that's right there. That's like the core of our purpose. But like you said, there's adjectives to that we are all called to be disciples and disciple makers and ministers to someone. But sometimes we focus on the adjective, a music minister or whatever it may be, that we get so caught up in the job description and forget that the actual core of our job is to minister and disciple people. And then you mentioned the flexibility of just being aware of the changes of seasons in our own lives as well as others, and then just culturally and maybe even globally if they impact us that way. We as individuals have to be aware of that, and then the church as a whole has to be aware of that. Now, you are someone that has traveled internationally. Your music has allowed you to go to different countries and play. If we could end with a conversation on what you have seen just internationally as far as the church and how the church can serve in that international mission field.
All right. Yeah, that's a
Yeah, big
that's a big
question
one.
to end on.
Well, I think first off, I just want to say, it's been such a huge blessing in my life that God has allowed me those opportunities to travel. I kind of had this epiphany moment one time, and I was doing my undergrad, and I was on the campus of Baylor. That's where I did my undergrad, and so I'm walking to class, and it's a beautiful campus. And I think that day it was just a beautiful day. Sun was shining. It was like 10 a.m. So nice morning. And I just thought, why me? Like, why do I get to be here? And obviously that's a question that only God and his sovereignty knows. Because I know that there's so many people, so many kids in many parts of this world that don't have those opportunities, but they probably have some incredible gifts and some incredible talents. And I'm thinking, specifically right now, just more musically, because that's kind of where the question is. But man, there's probably some kids with some outrageous musical talent working some diamond mines in Africa, and they'll never have the chance to even discover that they have the talent. And so it was just number one, just recognizing that, man, these opportunities that we have are just purely God's grace and God's mercy in our lives. We don't deserve them. God could have just as easily given them to someone else. I've heard Jim Cymbala, the pastor at Brooklyn Tab up in New York, and he called it, the accident of his birth. He didn't pick his country of origin. He didn't pick his parents. All of that was determined by God for him.
Yeah.
And so it's just God's grace and God's mercy. So kind of a long introduction to the answer, but just, man, all of that has just been God's grace and God's mercy in my life. But in traveling, I've been able to see a couple of different countries. Obviously, I've been to Mexico because my parents are from Mexico. So I've been able to see some churches there, some musical settings, several countries in Europe as well. Spain and Italy and Austria and Ukraine, and being able to see churches and even classical music settings there. And one of the things that really just impacted me was that music is a very universal tool. And I use the word tool because honestly, I believe that music is just a tool in God's arsenal. And I think that sometimes we can over romanticize the concept of music, that, oh, music is just this amazing thing and it's an art and all these, and I believe all of that. I mean, music is the only thing I've ever done in my entire life, and so I am 100%. I love music and it's great, but as believers, we know that number one, it's a tool for worship. It's just something that God has given us so that we can give glory back to Him, and it's also a way that we can reach people because everyone loves music, and everyone of all ages. You go into any nursing home in the United States and start playing music, and people will come out of the rooms and listen because they love it. You play music for any baby, and they perk up, they start dancing, they probably start rocking a bit, and we take a picture or like put it on Instagram or something because there's a natural reaction to it. And so that natural reaction happens all over the world. And so music is a great tool for actually reaching the nations. And there actually used to be official like IMB music missionaries that the IMB would send musicians to countries to reach them, but we don't necessarily do that anymore. But I think the concept is still there, and so I think music is a great way to reach the nations. In regards to the church, I think that from what I've seen just in my travels, that unfortunately the countries who have had access to the gospel for the longest are often the cult.
Well,
You think about what's happening right now in the Middle East, and just 2 days ago, I was listening to Joel Rosenberg, who's a novelist and was also like a political commentator, back in I think a decade ago. But he's is a Jewish believer. He lives in Jerusalem, and he was just saying how right now they've done a study and they were astounded at the rate that Jews in Israel are coming to Christ. You see the same thing in Iran and in other Arabic Middle Eastern countries. You see that in China. Right now, like the underground church in China is exploding, even in the face of persecution. South Korea is sending out more missionaries right now than the United States is. And you think, man, the gospel, I don't know this off the top of my head, but I would imagine that the gospel has been in the United States longer than it has been in Korea. And I think what happens is that we get comfortable with the gospel. And that's a really dangerous place to be, because when I read the New Testament, and even the Old Testament, I mean, the people of God, the Israelites, were very unique. If you read Joshua, and even the commandments in the Torah, you see that, like, hey, there's something different. We don't make an image to our gods, even though all of our neighbors do, and we don't intermarry because it might corrupt the faith. So those are all Old Testament laws that were given. But even the New Testament, you see that the disciples and the apostles and their writing of the epistles, there was this understanding that Christianity is countercultural. And I think what happens when Christianity becomes the norm, we get comfortable. And so a lot of these churches, especially like in the Western society, so like in England, Western Europe, even now a little bit in the United States, we see that Christianity is more of a title than a lifestyle. I think the main thing we can do, I think, is just get back to the main thing. And the main thing, and you alluded to this earlier, is that our number one calling is fellowship with Christ. And yes, there are other things that fall under that, but God has ultimately called us to love him. And that's Deuteronomy 6. That's the Shema. And you shall love the Lord your God, right? Basically with everything, your mind, your heart, your body, your soul, everything. And then there's a second commandment, love your neighbor. And I think in that we see that there's a necessity to preach the gospel to all nations. But I think a lot of times we as believers can get distracted, especially with good things, or we kind of pawn off our responsibility to a local government or a national government, and we think, well, we'll see cultural transformation if this law is passed, or if this judge is appointed, or if this person is in the local office, or if this person's in the White House. And the truth is, yeah, those things might help, but laws and societies and structures, they can't transform someone's life. I mean, if you really think about it, if laws had the power to transform the heart, the New Testament wouldn't be necessary. There's over 600 laws in the Old Testament. Obviously, there was still problems, there was still disobedience, there was still idolatry, but they had laws. And so I think a lot of times we feel safe, especially here, in the Bible Belt, right? Where we live in the South. And it's like, well, most people are Christians, and most society is not very liberal, although it's moving in that direction. And so we feel safe,
yeah.
and we don't live out the gospel, we don't share the gospel, and we don't even disciple those that we have in our churches. I feel like we've turned church attendance or Christianity into church attendance. You are a Christian if you show up for 1 hour on Sunday to hear some guy speak. And the truth is, man, the Christian walk is way more than that. Is meeting every week important? Yep, it's in the scriptures. Is having someone proclaim the word of God to you important? Yes, we see it all throughout the scriptures. But Christianity is not that happening for just 1 hour in your life and then that's it, or 1 hour in your week and then that's it. And I think that's been the norm for so long in these countries where churches are dying. Or we've even seen in some European nations old churches are being turned into mosques
Wow.
because Islam is growing and Christianity is declining. And I think the reason it's declining because people don't see the power of God in the churches. They don't see the presence of God in these churches. They just see empty rituals and empty orders and songs that maybe speak about God or try to worship God, but the Spirit is not there. And without the Spirit of God present, we're just making a lot of noise. And that might be cool noise, it may sound really good, but without the power of God in it, it's it's nothing. It has no power to change someone's life. And but the good news is the gospel is on the move in some countries, and I think God really is raising up a generation of people who are like, listen, this stuff isn't working. Tradition is not working. Norm, business as usual in church is not working. There's something more to this. And I think once unbelievers see the power of God's Spirit in someone's life, the power to transform someone's life. And when they have an encounter with the living God, that's when someone's transformed. Then a family is transformed. Then maybe a community, and then maybe a city, and then you see a whole movement of maybe an entire region that is being changed. So that's my prayer, man. Just in seeing the world as number one. The world is much bigger than what we think it is. It's much bigger than our little circle. It's much bigger than our normal. I go to this Walmart, I go to this school, I go to this church, and these are my friends, and that's it. I mean, the world is huge,
Yeah.
and people are so different, but we all have the same needs. We all we all are wired the same. God has wired us the same, and He says that He's wired us with eternity in our hearts. And so, everyone, doesn't matter where you are in this world, you know that there's a God out there and that He created you for something. And it's our mission to go to those nations and say, kind of like Paul did when he went to Athens, hey, this unknown God, I know Him. Let me tell you about Him. And let me tell you why you were created, which is ultimately to worship Him. And so I think that's our mission, man. And we start here locally, but if God gives us the opportunity, it's our mission and our blessing to be able to share that wherever he takes us.
That's awesome. There's so many. That was just like so many impactful things that you said there. One thing that stood out to me right away when you said it was that getting comfortable with the gospel can be very dangerous. And in the examples you gave of what's going on here in America and I guess just Western civilization that has grown so comfortable with the gospel, especially here in the Bible Belt and in America, and how you said that Christianity we've kind of associated with just church attendance, like just going to church is my Christian act of dedication for the week, but it's not just one day, it's a lifestyle. And just remembering, like you said, that Christianity is and always has been countercultural, that the people of God has always lived counter to the culture of the time, and just embracing the power of God and the presence of God and putting that on display in our lives is what really gets people to turn their heads and say, hey, what's going on over there? We all start out walking in the darkness, and whenever we see that little glimmer of light, it should draw those that are walking in the darkness. It should draw their attention. But like you said, so often, especially here in the Western side of the world, we're so familiar with the gospel that we don't just let that light shine brightly. And God is going to do what He's going to do with America and the rest of Western civilization, and He's doing great work, like you mentioned, in other areas that don't allow such a free expression of the Christian faith. Man, that was just so good what you said in this entire conversation. I want to go longer because it's always great to talk to you, but we are getting actually I think we went over time, but hey, it was definitely worth it. So considering that there's always so much to talk about with you, would you be willing to jump on for another interview sometime down the road?
Yeah, man, absolutely. It's always a blessing to be able to talk to a fellow believer, but obviously to you, man, we grew up together, and so Anytime.
Man,
You bet.
that's great. Well, we'll go ahead and end it here. Johann, thank you again for just coming on the show. It's really been a blessing. It's always a blessing to talk to you. Our prayers are with you and your family and the ministry that God has called you and your wife to there at Cross Church, and just the community that Cross Church is blessing and bringing the gospel to. Thank you so much for that.
All right, man. Thank you. It was great to be a part.
Wasn't that a great conversation? I hope you were taking notes, and if you weren't, then grab a pen and paper or open your note-taking app and go back and listen to this episode one more time. This episode was recorded earlier this year in March, and Johann mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that this month, October, would mark 7 years that he has been serving at Cross Church. So Johann, happy anniversary, and thank you for being a part of Radio Faith. I know this conversation will be a blessing to many people. To our audience, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode. If you've enjoyed this conversation with Johann or any of our other conversations, then can you do a favor for me? I'd really appreciate it if you leave us a comment and a rating on whatever platform you listen to Radio Faith. And also share this podcast with a friend. The conversations we have here on Radio Faith are such a blessing, and you have the power of making sure more people discover this podcast. Just leave a comment and a rating and tell some friends. Again, thank you for taking the time to listen to my conversation with Johann here on Radio Faith.